Welcome to the Humanist Freedoms podcast by Humanist Heritage Canada. We share stories and perspectives from Canada's ongoing humanist heritage. You can find us online at www.humanistfreedoms.com or www.humanistheritagecanada.ca. On our website, you may find the Humanist Freedoms news blog. Every week, we share news, information, and stories about what we call contemporary applied humanism. It's humanism in action. Humanist Heritage Canada is our new initiative to document and share the stories of Canada's rich humanist heritage. Henry Beissel is a Canadian poet who has published 24 volumes of poetry, 6 books of plays, and countless other articles and essays during a writing and publishing career that has spanned almost 60 years. He has also been an active humanist who has played important roles in some of Canada's leading humanist organizations. Today, we're continuing our exploration of Henry Beissel's Catastrophic Glory, a collection of essays which Henry states were previously delivered as talks and speeches during various public occasions. In view of the rapidly deteriorating situation across the world with accelerated climate change and its potentially catastrophic consequences, the rapid global financial collapse, a growing threat of nuclear conflict, a human population explosion that exceeds our planet's carrying capacity, and numerous other global threats to human survival, Henry feels compelled to share his observations with hope that humanists and others who care about human survival will join forces to oppose and find solutions to the existential threats that seem to be growing in urgency every year. Here is part 2 of Henry Beissel's Catastrophic Glory. Catastrophic Glory by Henry Beissel. 2. Evolution and Civilization, Catastrophe. But it's progress on all fronts, right? Things are getting better all the time, right? Our dreams are coming true, right? No, wrong. Thrice wrong. Not even the most thoughtless materialist utopian can ignore the signs that something has gone seriously wrong with our triumphant march to a better, happier world. Whether you look at the environment or the economy, politics or education, our ethics or our resources, science or technology, even the arts, everywhere decline, degradation, and corruption are mounting. Alarms are going off around the world warning of an impending cataclysm. In 1947, in the aftermath of World War II, a team of atomic scientists that included 13 Nobel laureates created the doomsday clock as a means of measuring the time left before nuclear war and/or climate change will put an end to the human species. At the end of January 2020, they advanced the clock to 100 seconds before midnight. That is, less than 2 minutes before the apocalypse. No one can know what the future will bring, but it is deeply disturbing that, as scientists see it, today is the closest the world has ever come to self-destruction, and we are responsible for it. What has happened to the promise of our progress in intelligence, science, technology, and politics that at the very moment that we have evolved to within sight of a utopia, the whole imaginative construct of a better world is collapsing? As so often in this world, the very triumph carries the seeds of its own undoing. The forces we unleash to serve us are now threatening to destroy us. One facet of this ominous development is our sense of superiority, which, bolstered by our success in dominating our planet, has infected us with a malignant case of megalomania. The Greeks recognized this as a fatal state of hubris. They knew it would be followed by nemesis, that is, an inevitable downfall. There are those who dismiss such misgivings as doomsday mongering. There have been many such pessimistic predictions throughout history, they say, and yet we humans are still around. This objection ignores the facts thrice. Firstly, many civilizations are in fact no longer around. Take the Mayan civilization, for instance, that once flourished as confidently as ours. For all their progress in the arts, science, and statehood, all that remains today are the ruins of their cities that we are digging up in the jungles of Guatemala, Belize, and El Salvador. Or take the Rapa Nui civilization that flourished less than a millennium ago on the Polynesian islands, and of whom we know not much more than their monumental stone sculptures. There are scores of vanished civilizations that left meager traces of their once flourished world. Yes, we Westerners are still very much in evidence, but for how much longer, no one knows. History is the story of the rise and fall of empires. The only certainty is that our civilization won't last forever because no. Arguably, one of the causes for the disappearance of civilizations is humanity's fondness for warfare. There has been much sincere and thoughtful talk about peace for all people for millennia. In modern times, the rallying call of the French Revolution, liberté, égalité, fraternité, was to set in motion humanity's march towards a world of peace and justice. But the march was quickly taken over by the brutal militarism of Napoleon, just in time for Beethoven to remove the dedication of his Ninth Symphony to him, which ends with his Ode to Joy. The ode was actually written by the poet Friedrich Schiller and celebrates the magic power of joy, that divine spark to create a world where all people become brothers. Alle Menschen werden Brüder. There is some debate as to whether Schiller originally wrote Freiheit, freedom, Schöner Götterfunke, making freedom the power that will make all humans brothers and sisters, a version that makes a lot of political sense. However, despite all the manifestos, revolutions, and protest marches over the centuries, there has been little progress towards a non-violent world of universal brotherhood. If anything, we've become more divided and more aggressive than ever. The very demonstrations for peace nowadays often turn into exercises in civil war. We've witnessed two of the most murderous wars in the history of humankind in our own time. World War I and World War II killed more than 100 million soldiers and civilians. The Industrial Revolution, for all the good it has done us, unleashed a rapid scientific and technological development in the creation of weapons, a gun culture that dominates the world today. It has created weapons of mass destruction, culminating in the most horrific weapon of all, the nuclear bomb. The first of them, ironically named Little Boy, even more ironically, it was the US, the nation that proclaims itself the champion of freedom and democracy, that dropped Little Boy on Hiroshima, leveling that city instantly and incinerating more than 100,000 human beings, mostly women and children. Another 40,000 died hideously from radiation sickness within 6 months of the blast. Not content with this gruesome devastation, the civilized US dropped another nuclear device, Fat Man, on Nagasaki with equally horrific results. Since then, our military technocrats have perfected nuclear bombs so that a single one now yields 3,000 times the destructive power of the Hiroshima bomb. That means such a bomb could kill 300 million humans in a single blast, to say nothing of the long term effect of the accompanying lethal radiation upon all forms of life. Such catastrophically destructive weapons are now in the hands of many nations, some of them politically unstable, others demonstrably terrorist. You don't have to be a pessimist to fear that eventually a nuclear holocaust will be unleashed that would put an end to the human story. The usual deniers take refuge in an argument of analogy. When, they argue, in the 14th century the English adopted as their favorite weapon the Welsh longbow, whose 5-foot yew resilience could be bent to such force that its arrows were able to travel 400 yards, hit their targets accurately at 200 yards and easily penetrate the heaviest armor of the night, there were voices predicting the end of mankind in a bloodbath caused by this new, unstoppable weapon of mass destruction. We have survived the Welsh longbow. This same argument applied seriously to atomic warfare would be the height of folly. The longbow made cavalry and the medieval knight obsolete. It may even have decided the Hundred Years' War in favor of the English, but it did not and could not wipe out humanity. Nuclear weapons, however, can, and if there is a World War III, they may. The country that is most vociferous in denouncing weapons of mass destruction in others has a stockpile of them sufficient to end not only human but also most other forms of animal life on Earth. This duplicity is the hallmark of modern politics, surely an ominous reversal in statecraft in our civilization. The current military exchange between Russia and Ukraine is fought with the threat of nuclear weapons in the background, and it is impossible to overlook the immense amounts of arms and ammunition supplied to Ukraine by the US and NATO to realize the political economic objectives at the heart of the conflict. Evidently, Americans have ignored Eisenhower's warning in his final address. We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. One thing is clear: if humanity is to survive, we have to find a way to put an end to warfare, which at best is a brutal engagement that costs millions of lives and achieves nothing beyond enriching the tycoons of the international military-industrial complex. With the introduction of nuclear weapons, war may also spell the end of Homo stupidus. One of the causes of war is well documented by the war George W. Bush declared on Iraq, on the manufactured pretext of wanting to destroy Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction, which he knew did not exist. Talk of duplicity. Of course, little George inherited his ethics from the other George, his father, who had invaded Iraq on equally false pretenses a few years earlier, killing a few 100,000 Iraqis but not finishing the job of bombing the country to pieces. The real object of the murderous Bush invasions was to destroy Iraq as a functioning state, so as to guarantee America's control of Iraq's rich oil reserves. But the Bushes publicly declared that the brutal war they had forced upon an innocent nation was necessary in the service of freedom, democracy, and peace. They repeated this blatant lie over and over again, with the calm hypocrisy of the clinically insane who no longer connect the horrific things they are saying and doing to the reality of the world around them. To make matters worse, it was the Americans who installed Saddam Hussein as president to serve the interests of the US in the Iraqi oil fields. When he began to serve his own people rather than the Americans, he had to be disposed of. Alas, the Bushes are not alone among political leaders today who are corrupt, hypocritical, and out of touch with the real world. There are other achievements of our civilization that have unexpectedly exacted a terrible price for their benefit. Perhaps the biggest boon to our lives that technology and industrialization have bestowed on us is the ease and speed of transportation and travel. If you haven't realized yet that this development has contributed to a catastrophic climate change that is accelerating day by day, you're in for some terrifying experiences soon. Climate change alone may make the planet uninhabitable for humanity. This threat to our survival also had its origin in positive evolutionary developments. Driven by the need to follow the seasons and the migration of animals for food and water, as well as by an unquenchable curiosity, our species has been remarkably restless from the beginning. It no doubt inherited its nomadic lifestyle from its ancestor Homo erectus, who began to spread out from Africa as early as 2 million years ago and migrated throughout what is now Asia and Europe. All this trekking was accomplished on foot. It was not until 5,000 years ago that we invented the sailboat and the wheel. Ironically, by that time we had largely left our nomadic life behind us and begun to farm for food and build settlements, which made possible a more tranquil lifestyle. This all started around 10,000 years ago with the Neolithic Revolution that introduced agriculture to our world. One of the immediate consequences was that the human population began to expand rapidly. As farming made larger amounts of food available, hunter gatherers opted for the more reliable life of farming and began to settle in ever larger communities. Eventually, first cities like Ur and Eridu arose in Mesopotamia in the 8th century BCE. Urbanization was launched, and today, 10,000 years later, it continues at an accelerated pace. But settlement did not spell the end of travel. Quite the contrary. The concentration of people in one place created a need for trade. A global market began to open up to food supply, building materials, tools, textiles, furniture, jewelry, spices, gold and silver, all the things needed and or desired in an urban world. And they had to be transported across vast stretches between Asia and Europe. The sailing boat became a crucial vehicle to bring goods to market and thereby foster the growth of cities on the shores of lakes, rivers, and the sea. By the 5th century BCE, Hanno the navigator and early explorer of the Phoenician civilization was sailing with a fleet of ships from Carthage along the western coast of Europe as far as the British Isles. On land, trade routes were established that similarly supported global commerce. One of the best known is the so called Silk Road, actually a system of roads connecting southern China, where the Han civilization was flourishing in the 2nd century BCE, with Europe and Africa. All this required transportation, which led in time to the automobile and global networks of highways, both of which had a negative effect on our health and the quality of life on this planet. One thing is clear. If the doomsday prophets turn out to be right, we will have been the victims of our own success. Advances in medicine have resulted in a population explosion that already has catastrophic dimensions in many parts of the world and threatens to be our undoing. Despite an endless stream of scientific inventions and technological innovations, we can no longer keep pace with the demands for labor, food, housing, healthcare, and the many amenities and luxuries to which we have become accustomed. At a time when the world population is well past the 7 billion mark on its way to 10 billion or more before the middle of this century, the experts have calculated that the planet can sustain no more than 2 billion humans at an average Western standard of living. One of the consequences of a population explosion that exceeds the carrying capacity of the planet is a catastrophic depreciation of the Earth's environment. Even if we could sustain the current population growth, industrialization comes at a high price. Pollution from manufacturing processes and industrial waste from engine exhaust and other forms of burning fuel is producing catastrophic changes in the environment and the climate. These impact us now globally. Floods, droughts, wildfires, hurricanes, tornadoes, blizzards, and other extreme forms of weather are steadily intensifying, devastating cities, harvests, farmland, and forests. Moreover, the toxic substances we release into the air, the water, and the soil are killing marine life by acidifying the oceans, poisoning our own food supplies as well as the air we breathe, and thinning the ozone layer that protects us from the sun's more lethal radiation, causing an unprecedented cancer epidemic around the world. As a consequence of accelerating global warming, the polar ice caps and mountain glaciers worldwide are melting, and oceans are rising to levels that will eventually put most of our major cities along the huge tracts of land underwater. This sounds extreme. It is extreme. But catastrophes of this order of magnitude have happened before in the history of our planet. They were the result of events caused by the laws of nature that determine all. The difference today is that the current catastrophes are happening thanks to the presence and actions of Homo sapiens. We are the architects of the disasters now upon us. The combination of overpopulation, industrialization, and an expanding global technological society is straining the capacities of our planet to breaking point in every respect. World food production has peaked because soils have become depleted. Today, half of the Earth's population is malnourished, and the supplies of fresh water are dwindling because of overuse, toxic poisons released, and gigantic waste produced by us. Every day, 10,000 people, half of them children, die from lack of clean water and sanitation around the world. The resulting pressures are dramatically amplified by the appalling social inequalities everywhere. The consequence is a steep rise in social unrest, leading, beyond protest marches, to conditions of civil war in a growing number of countries around the world. Add to this the slow destruction of the rainforests in Africa, Southeast Asia, and South America, which some have called the world's lungs, and also the disappearance of once superabundant fish stocks like the cod off the coast of Newfoundland and the salmon off the west coast. And add the fact that we are in the midst of a man made species extinction equal to one triggered by the asteroid strike some 66 million years ago, which killed off most animal species from the ammonite to the dinosaur. Add the threat of global pandemics due to the spread of bacteria and viruses strengthened by and now immune to the very antibiotic medications intended to eradicate them. Add the prospect that at the present rate of consumption, oil and gas as energy resources will soon be exhausted, along with the precious metals and minerals essential to the manufacture of some of our most sophisticated digital technologies. And finally, add the growing threat of nuclear war, and you get a sense of the gravity and enormity of the crisis facing humanity today. It is particularly tragic that at this very time, when the self destructive propensities of our otherwise creative Western civilization call for a collaborative effort of all the nations of the world to confront and deal collectively with our malaise, we find ourselves lamentably lacking what we most urgently need: moral and political leadership. Instead, the world is at the mercy of saber rattling and warmongering leaders who, armed to the teeth with weapons of mass destruction, hypocritically propose to bring peace and democracy to nations by bombing them back into the Stone Age. These brutal and totally unwarranted invasions demonstrate the extent to which the political affairs of the world are dictated by what President Eisenhower called the military industrial complex. He warned us of what was to come more than a half century ago, and things have become worse rather than better, as the war in Ukraine demonstrates. The men, alas, now also the women, who lead us into military battle are ignorant of the fact that conventional war is obsolete. The next world war will be fought with nuclear weapons, and that will put an end to human civilization for centuries to come, and perhaps forever. War, along with the imperialism that it sustains, belongs to an irretrievable past, along with the political dinosaurs who are still committed to it. Instead, we need to develop and put in place ways of negotiating agreements and compromises, as well as institutions to implement them. The UN is an important start, but it needs to be strengthened and made more democratic so that it can no longer be used by imperialists to conceal their rapacity. Perhaps its headquarters should be moved out of the USA into a more peaceful, non aligned country. If tomorrow's world is going to be at the mercy of a superpower that acts as though it were a law unto itself, this future will be bleak indeed. It is to a large extent in response to such arrogance that a new form of violence has arisen, as was dramatically demonstrated by the 9/11 terrorist attack on the World Trade Center in New York. Actually, terrorism is not all that new. Attacks on civilians in the service of some ideological program or objective go a long way back in our history. What is new is the potential for destruction and death rebels can cause. Thanks to our advanced technology in communication and transportation, and thanks to the ease with which a great variety of deadly weapons can be obtained or produced, a relatively small number of terrorists can kill a disproportionately large number of innocent civilians. It is only a matter of time before some crazed terrorist organization will manage to detonate a nuclear device in a densely populated place. Draconian measures of security and surveillance cannot stop terrorism. On the contrary, they will serve to create ever more repressive forms of government, which in turn will engender more terrorist reaction. Only if we address the roots of this global violent protest can we hope to turn its destructive force into creative engagement. Since 9/11, much has been written about terrorism, but there has been little analysis of what conditions breed terrorists. Frustration in the face of brutal injustice is probably one of the major forces that makes terrorists out of ordinary people. One thing is certain: neither tanks nor aerial bombardments will put a stop to them. Such reactions are on the intelligence level of one who proposes to fight the AIDS virus with the electric chair. You can kill a few carriers that way, but the virus will continue to spread exponentially under your very eyes. Some of the Arab suicide bombers provide an instructive case study that may take us quickly to questions of ethics on the part of individuals and power politics on the part of states. In fact, none of the components of the cataclysmic crisis we are facing can be addressed without a consideration of the question of ethics. One of the root problems of our time is that we no longer have a moral law sanctioned by an unquestionable authority, such as the Christian, Muslim, or Judaic God. He, she, or it is dead. In fact, he, she, it never existed, but the theist fantasy did and still does, though it is morally defunct and we have found no viable substitute for it. The demise of religion as an active faith has pulled the moral rug from under our feet. The question is, can a society survive in a state of moral relativity in which everyone decides independently what is right and what is wrong? The brief answer is no. So, where can we find new common ground for moral laws that are binding on everyone? The heavens won't open up to supply the answer. We have to find it here on earth in our day-to-day interactions, and I believe we can. It involves disposing of the self-serving power structures that lord it over us today and replace them with a viable compromise between individual desires and community needs that embodies our best vision of what we want our lives and world to be. The invasion of Iraq has also raised fundamental questions about what has become of democracy in our time. The leaders of the UK, Spain, and Australia, who agreed to support the United States of America in their determination to attack Iraq militarily, did so against the expressed will of the overwhelming majority of the very people who elected them to office. All of these leaders ignored huge, unprecedented demonstrations opposing a war against Iraq. The headlong rush we are witnessing in the land of the free to pass ill-considered legislation arbitrarily curtailing the liberties of innocent citizens, such as women's rights to an abortion, does not augur well for the future. In fact, it smacks of the dark days of fascism. How can such government-induced repression be prevented from destroying the very basis of civil society? Another way of addressing the question is to inquire into how to make democratically elected leaders responsive to the will of the electorate at all times, and not just at election time. What are the ethics of governing a country? It should be evident by now that progress has come to a place that looks as though it were going to cancel all the benefits it has brought us. How do we get ourselves into this cul-de-sac? And how are we to find a viable path into the future? The earlier sketch of the achievements of Western civilization argues for the capacity of humankind for constructive, positive, creative action. Given the severity of the crisis facing us, it is of supreme importance that we not surrender to pessimism, that we neither resign nor despair. It is not a question of the apocalypse now, at least not yet. To the extent that the ills of our age are our own doing, we can also undo them. We must examine the symptoms concretely, precisely, and honestly before we can make a diagnosis to attempt a cure. Some of the leading historians of culture, from Giambattista Vico to Oswald Spengler and Arnold Toynbee, have argued that civilizations are complex organisms which are born, grow to maturity, flourish, then decline and die. Archaeology bears witness to the flowering of many a culture and their subsequent disappearance. Different civilizations have often existed at the same time in different places. Human history is the graveyard where they lie buried. The process is always one from primitive conditions to a world of beauty and sophistication before they subside once more into barbarism. But for every culture which dies, a new one is born. Yeats believed that this birth occurs at the point at which the old one falls apart, and that he was living at a time of the death of the Christian civilization. In the poem quoted above, he speculates on the nature of the new order about to come into being and wonders in a powerful final image, what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. He is wondering, in other words, what kind of civilization will replace our moribund Judeo-Christian one. This vision of the life and death of civilizations raises important issues. Archaeological evidence puts the coming and going of civilizations beyond dispute, but what are the symptoms of their decline? How can we know that our civilization is dying? How can we be sure that it will be replaced by another? The disappearance of the great Mayan civilization, for instance, would suggest that not all dying civilizations are reborn. What makes this prospect especially disturbing is the fact that we are currently indulging in a frenzy of technology which is rapidly globalizing human society, turning it into McLuhan's global village. It's hard to imagine that different individual cultures will ever again spring up separately in different places on this earth. This means that if a new civilization is about to be born, it will be a global one that encompasses all humanity. What if ours fails to spawn a new one? Does the global village also imply that the coming catastrophes is going to be global? Are we then facing the end of human civilization? After all, for the first time in the history of our species, we have the means to self-destruct, and there is scant evidence that we also have the will and the wisdom to commit to a creative path into the future. Thank you for taking time to visit the Humanist Freedoms podcast. We hope you enjoyed listening as much as we enjoyed putting the show together. If you liked this or any episode of the podcast, please consider subscribing or leaving a review wherever you listen to podcasts. If you have a humanist story idea, or feedback to share, you can reach us at humanistfreedoms@gmail.com.